Scroll through social media today, and it feels less like a feed and more like a battlefield. On one side stand the baby boomers, criticized for stockpiling wealth, holding onto obsolete beliefs, and refusing to step aside. On the opposite side are millennials and Gen Z, more vocal than ever about exhaustion, soaring living costs, identity debates, and a future that always seems just out of reach. The volume never drops. The anger never really ends. Yet if you pay close attention, there's another group lingering in the background. They aren't shouting. They aren't going viral. They aren't posting long, multi-part threads. They're simply observing, coffee in hand. And there's that subtle, knowing smirk on their face that says, "Yeah, I've watched this play out before." That group is Generation X, born roughly between 1965 and 1980. General X became the overlooked middle child of American history, too late to benefit from the boomers' economic heyday, and too early to be framed as the struggling younger generation deserving of empathy. Most of the time, they're barely acknowledged until something goes wrong. Then, suddenly, they're expected to step in and handle it. Gen X didn't fade into the background by coincidence. They were conditioned to stay out of sight, and growing up with the understanding that no one is coming to rescue you doesn't just influence how you live. It fundamentally reshapes who you are. This isn't just a history lesson, it's a psychological profile of an entire generation. This is the psychology of Generation X, the quiet observers of the culture war. And to truly understand the Gen X mindset, you have to return to the moment when that mindset was first formed, childhood. And the most defining symbol of a Gen X childhood wasn't a family gathered around the dinner table. It was a house key, hanging from a string around a child's neck. During the 1970s and 1982, the structure of American family life quietly shifted. Divorce became more common. Households with two working parents turned into the norm. More women joining the workforce marked real social progress. But it also left a gap in childcare that no one fully knew how to solve. As a result, millions of children grew up in a new role. Latchkey kids. Picture the scene. It's 3:20 in the afternoon. The school bus pulls away. You head home by yourself. The streets are still. You unlock the door and step inside, greeted by silence. No footsteps. No one calling out to you. No sense of adult presence. Only the low buzz of the refrigerator and the lingering scent of last night's meal. You grab your own snack. You do your homework with the television murmuring in the background. If you trip and scrape your knee, you wash it off and keep going. If fear creeps in, you push it down. If loneliness hits, you don't even have the language to describe it yet. Psychologists might label this as benign neglect. Not abuse, not intentional harm, but something more understated: being physically protected while emotionally left on your own. And growing up in that kind of setting programs the mind in a very particular way. When you're 8 years old and no one is coming to save you, you absorb a harsh truth early on. Help doesn't arrive automatically. Comfort isn't promised. Attention has to be earned or learned to live without. That's the root of Gen X's well-known self-reliance. But it's also where something far more complex begins. Because growing up feeling overlooked doesn't just create independence. It teaches you how to fade into the background by choice. You learn to take up less room, to want less, to handle your problems silently, and over time, that survival tactic hardens into character. It becomes who you are. Here's the detail most people overlook. The latchkey child never stopped craving love. They simply stopped counting on it. They grew into adults who can endure almost anything, yet hesitate to reach out for support. Adults who can push through pain, but don't know how to let someone sit with them in it. That's the true Gen X backstory. Not indulged, not damaged, just conditioned early on to stay unseen. One of the biggest misconceptions about Generation X is the belief that they're emotionally distant. They aren't distant, they're compressed. They experience emotion as deeply as anyone else, sometimes even more so. But they were raised in an environment where feelings were treated as a nuisance. Sadness was met with, toughen up. Anxiety was brushed off with, handle it. Tears were labeled dramatic. So Gen X developed a coping mechanism that can resemble emotional maturity, but often isn't. They learned emotional minimalism, express little, ask for little, need little at least on the surface, just not in words. That's why a Gen Xer rarely says, "I'm overwhelmed." Instead, you'll hear, "Good." They don't say, "Miss you." They ask, "You still breathing?" And when they care about you, it usually doesn't come as poetry. It shows up as action. They repair your car. They're there when it counts. They solve issues before you even realize they exist. That's how they express love, because it feels safer than exposing vulnerability. And the sarcasm? That isn't meanness. It's emotional armor, a way to release pain without sounding fragile, a method of admitting anxiety without turning it into a scene, a way to stay close while keeping defenses intact. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Gen X wasn't taught how to talk about emotions. They were taught how to operate despite them. That's why they can be emotionally aware, yet emotionally inaccessible. They can carry everyone else's weight while quietly overlooking their own needs. Not because they lack compassion, but because, for a long time, the unspoken rule was clear: feel it in private, deal with it alone, keep moving. This is the Gen X paradox. The same quality that made them resilient is also what leaves them isolated. When you grow up as a latchkey kid, independence isn't a personality preference, it's a survival mechanism. Your mind learns to spot problems and fix them quickly, silently, without permission, and without relying on emotional support. You grow into someone who is capable, not just reliable, but competent in a quiet, almost unsettling way. The kind of person who stays calm in a workplace crisis, repairs what's broken, and still makes it to the meeting on time. The person others depend on when their world starts to collapse, but extreme self-sufficiency carries an invisible cost. There's a moment when independence stops being a strength and turns into a barrier. Gen X didn't internalize the idea, "I can handle this." They absorbed something heavier, "I must handle this." And that small shift changes everything. It creates adults who feel uneasy accepting help, even when they're exhausted and in need. Adults who don't vent, because complaining feels pointless. Adults who don't reach out not from indifference, but because some deep, learned belief says no one is coming anyway. Over time, that belief hardens into emotional isolation. They aren't lonely in an obvious way. Many have families, careers, social circles. Yet internally, there's often a quiet sense of loneliness that comes from always being the dependable one. This helps explain why many Gen Xers struggle with therapy, not because they dismiss it, but because vulnerability feels like an unfamiliar language. Their inner child is still repeating the rule learned at 8 years old. Deal with it yourself, don't inconvenience anyone. Hyper-independence can be a superpower, but without learning how to be supported, it can become a personal kind of cage. If hyper-independence is the engine driving the Gen X psyche, then cynicism is its protective shell. Gen X didn't come of age in a time that encouraged trust. They watched institutions fracture in real time. Watergate showed them that presidents could lie. The Cold War taught them tomorrow wasn't promised. The Challenger disaster taught them that even the future itself could fail suddenly, publicly, and violently. Then came the 1980s, shiny on the surface, loud, relentlessly upbeat, even as everything underneath felt fragile. Gen X became the first generation raised in a world of constant advertising. From Saturday morning cartoons to shopping mall culture, they were treated like a captive market. Over time, their minds adjusted. They developed a highly sensitive internal warning system, a built-in detector for nonsense. That's where the classic Gen X attitude comes from. Whatever. But that word is often misunderstood. Whatever doesn't mean indifference. It means, I'm not investing my emotions in something that's likely performative or false. From a psychological standpoint, it's emotional self-protection, a way of keeping expectations low enough that disappointment can't do real damage. Not because of pessimism, but because experience taught them better. That's why Gen X is skeptical of hype, whether it's a political catchphrase, a corporate vision statement, or a viral trend promising to transform your life in 30 days. They've watched too many grand promises fall apart, so they don't get excited out loud. They don't applaud easily. They don't chase glossy narratives. And if you want to earn a Gen Zer's respect, there's only one currency they truly trust: authenticity. Not the polished kind, the real thing. Because to Gen X, an uncomfortable truth feels safer than a beautiful lie. On a cognitive level, Gen X holds a rare advantage that neither earlier nor later generations fully share. They were shaped by two different worlds. Their childhood unfolded in an analog world, tangible, unhurried, immersive. They rode bikes without GPS trackers, got lost and had to find their own way back, memorized phone numbers, unfolded paper maps, and lived in a time when boredom was real. And boredom sparked imagination. Their minds were trained for patience, sustained attention, and hands-on problem solving. Then, just as they were coming of age, the digital revolution arrived. Suddenly, there were personal computers, email, dial-up connections, flip phones, and an entirely new way of living. Gen X didn't simply observe that shift, they adjusted to it. They became fluent in both worlds. That's why Gen X is psychologically bilingual. Baby boomers often have trouble instinctively trusting new technology. Gen Z can sometimes struggle to picture solutions that don't involve an app. Gen X, however, can navigate both. They can manage a spreadsheet, reboot a router, wrestle with a broken printer, and still know how to solve a problem the old-fashioned way when technology collapses. At work, this makes them the interpreters, the connective tissue, the people who can speak both hierarchy and flexibility, professionalism and memes. But there's a cost few people acknowledge. Gen X never got to fully settle into either reality. They had to keep adjusting. They helped build the digital future while still carrying the weight of analog responsibilities. They're the generation helping their parents log into accounts while training younger colleagues on systems older than they are. Two worlds, two speeds, one nervous system, and that constant mental switching creates a subtle, persistent exhaustion that Gen X almost never talks about. Gen X may not be the loudest voices in the room, but when real work needs to happen, they're usually the ones making it happen. That's not just a cultural glitch, it's psychological conditioning. Latchkey kids weren't guided step by step through life. They learn by adapting, fixing problems on the fly, and cleaning up chaos without praise. As adults, this turned Gen X into the generation of unseen labor, the quiet engines that keep systems functioning while others debate how those systems should work. They don't need inspirational slogans. They need fewer barriers in their way. And that's exactly why Gen X has zero tolerance for being treated like children at work. Micromanagement doesn't merely irritate them, it feels insulting. In their nervous system, control signals a lack of trust. And lack of trust feels deeply personal. There's an inner child who had to raise themselves hearing a single message: "You don't think I can handle this." So Gen X tends to respond the same way every time, not with loud rebellion or viral outrage, but with silent resistance. They do the job. Steer clear of office politics, skip unnecessary meetings, and guard their autonomy as if it were oxygen. Because for Gen X, independence isn't a workplace preference, it's part of their identity. The moment every move is monitored, it doesn't feel like management. It feels like a threat to survival. To understand the current mental landscape of Gen X, set the stereotypes aside. Forget the slackers, forget the flannel shirts, forget the sarcastic catchphrases. Look at their schedules. Gen X is now in their 40s and 52nds, living inside what psychologists often describe as a pressure zone known as the sandwich generation. They're squeezed between two demanding realities at once. On one side are aging baby boomer parents living longer than any generation before them, but often dealing with chronic illness, cognitive decline, or ongoing medical needs that require constant care. Gen X finds themselves booking doctor visits, navigating insurance systems, organizing medications, and answering late-night calls that begin with, "Something's wrong." On the other side are their children, Gen Z and Gen Alpha, growing up in an economy that often feels unforgiving: soaring tuition, skyrocketing rent, mental health challenges, social media pressure, and a job market that offers little sense of security. These kids don't just need financial help. They need emotional steadiness. They need presence. They need parents who can emotionally hold them. And in the middle of all of this, Gen X is still expected to perform at work as if nothing else is happening. This is the generation that stepped into adulthood just as pensions were fading and retirement shifted into a personal responsibility. They lived through the dot-com collapse. They were hit hard by the 2008 financial crisis during their peak earning years. Then the pandemic arrived and destabilized everything all over again. Many are still juggling mortgages, debt, and a lingering fear that they may never fully get ahead. Psychologically, this produces a very specific kind of strain, a form of burnout that doesn't look like burnout. Gen X rarely breaks down publicly. They don't post emotional meltdowns online. They don't write long threads about exhaustion. They just keep moving. They wake up early, support their kids, check in on their parents, attend meetings, manage crises, pay the bills, and then fall asleep with their jaw tight, only to repeat the cycle the next day. This is why Gen X is particularly vulnerable to something quietly dangerous: high-functioning depression. You can remain productive and still be depressed. You can be reliable and still be sinking. You can be the dependable one and still be quietly falling apart. The latchkey kids who learned to ask for nothing grew into adults from whom everyone expects everything. That's the real tragedy of the sandwich trap. Gen X is holding an entire family system together while being emotionally conditioned to never request support. So they don't say, "I can't keep doing this." They say, "I'm okay," and then they continue silently, tirelessly, until their body eventually demands a pause. This is where Gen X gets pressure from both sides. Baby boomers often interpret them as emotionally distant. General Z frequently sees them as too direct or blunt. The reality is that Gen X rarely feels fully understood by either generation. In relationships, many Gen Xers feel deeply, but they express it differently. They don't always communicate in emotional monologues. They communicate through dependability by showing up, solving problems, staying grounded when everything feels unstable. But because they were taught to contain themselves, closeness can feel dangerous. Relying on someone can register as vulnerability or even weakness. So they love intensely while simultaneously protecting themselves. Parenting brings another layer of contradiction. Many Gen X parents want their children to feel supported in ways they never experienced. At the same time, they genuinely believe struggle builds resilience. As a result, they can sound harsh even when their intentions are protective. They might say, "Figure it out," while quietly ensuring you don't fall too far. And when it comes to identity and culture, Gen X tends to value freedom, but has little tolerance for performative behavior. They're not bothered by difference, they're bothered by inconsistency. They can respect who you are while still rolling their eyes at moral theater. So once again, they find themselves caught in the middle, too gentle for the old guard, too blunt for the new one, quietly thinking, "No one really understands us," and honestly, being too exhausted to explain. As Gen X moves beyond the midpoint of life, something subtle yet powerful starts to unfold. For decades, they lived in survival mode, carrying everything, asking for nothing, staying out of sight just to keep things functioning. But now, many Gen Xers are arriving at a crossroads. Not a collapse, a shift. They're walking away from well-paid jobs that no longer feel meaningful, launching small businesses, making art, simplifying their lives, not out of recklessness, but clarity. They finally understand something important. They played the game, and the reward wasn't worth the price. And this is where healing begins. Gen X is learning that independence doesn't have to mean isolation, that strength doesn't require silence, that needing support doesn't make you weak. You're allowed to ask for help. You're allowed to feel exhausted. You're allowed to choose yourself. If you're Gen X, share in the comments which part resonated most. And if you want more deep psychological breakdowns like this, subscribe to the channel. We're not finished analyzing the generations just yet. Thanks for watching.